Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
I think that is yes. There is a huge cognitive dissonance that appears when you realize that, on the one hand, diabetes is the 7th largest killer of people in America, disproportionately affecting low-income communities, while at the same time, we have a drug called Trulicity, where for people who are on it, over 90% of them should survive. What's the problem here? The problem is that there is not enough access to these drugs because they cost way too much. We are fine with a world where maybe companies make comparatively less money. I think at the point where we provide enough of a profit incentive for them to do specific things, they'll be fine on that front. What we care about more, independent of things like innovation or protecting those kinds of things, is just increasing the access, right? Because what's killing people is not that we haven't made some iterative, tiny, small improvement, which is like the nature of how the pharmaceutical industry works. You don't just have huge leaps and bounds normally. What is killing people is that they just straight up cannot afford these drugs because the existence of the patent system creates government-supported monopolies that make it such that individuals can not afford drugs because the drug companies can just scalp them, where companies can just say that specifically for people who have drugs that where only a very small amount of drugs or a small amount of people have that disease, these people are probably the most vulnerable, and like there literally are not other companies or other countries that even make drugs for that specific market outside of places like the US. So what am I going to do in this speech? First, I'm going to explain to you how it is that we improve affordability by increasing the amount of access, but also making it such that supply can meet demand by changing the frontier upon which companies are going to compete, because now we will not just be racing to get patents. Secondarily, I'll be talking about how we're actually going to be better for innovation by shaping what kinds of drugs we'll be pursuing. But first, on the model, how is it that we're going to compensate specific drugs? We're going to use quality adjusted life years based on what we observe and what we think this drug is probably going to do, and make the amount of money that we pay out proportional. What does this look like? Rogaine might make some people happy and you'll get some payout for making comparatively better Rogaine, but if by some miracle you make the cure to cancer, we're willing to make the cash price really, really large. So first, on affordability, what's the problem right now? We think that companies have a huge market share once they get the patent, and at that point then, it is anti-competitive on 2 levels. First, in the short term, it is anti-competitive because, like, just de facto, it prevents other companies from making a similar drug or making a similar drug, and because of that, companies can just price however they want. Importantly, because they've already entered this market, companies are not going to try to innovate in that space, right? Because there's already someone there. For the same amount of R&D that you would put into that, you would just move that R&D to somewhere else, which means you will never try and A, make a better product, or B, make a cheaper product. In the long term, though, this is still true, because once the patent is removed, you didn't just sit on your ass at that time. You already are in the lead. You already have contracts with the best hospitals in the country. So now you just use that lead to make a better product, and now that's going to be the major product. So who gives a fuck if 25 years from now we have generics for Trulicity, when literally the only drugs that are going to be prescribed or on the market, because these will be the best drugs, will just be Trulicity 2.0. So there's never an incentive for people to ever compete here. That's why drugs like Lipitor have never been challenged, because they've been making iteratively better versions of Lipitor, which is the largest, most bought drug to control things like cholesterol. So that is how we affect affordability in terms of removing the anti-competitive nature. Secondarily, I think we remove affordability because we think they'll actually compete now to make more generics. Why is this the case? It is super expensive to do R&D right now. It is very risky. You need lots of testing, so it means you have to pay a lot of fees and regulations because you are testing on individuals, and that's really dangerous and things like this. You expose yourself to a fuck ton of liability, and this just isn't the same when you're just manufacturing drugs that you know already exist. So you're just going to be more profitable in that space because the costs are way lower. So we think a lot of corporations are going to move their operations to producing generics of existing drugs that have a huge market share and that no one is touching right now, right? So we are fine if fewer companies are working on Lipitor 2.0 if we can actually make it such that people can afford fucking Lipitor contributor because now more corporations are going to be moving their operations towards producing that. We think that that's probably going to be a good thing because they're going to like increase the supply and decrease the price. Secondarily, though, it also changes how you compete. You're going to be focusing on your operations, which you don't do as much in the status quo. If you are literally the only person selling a drug, you probably don't care as much about how optimized your supply chains are, the ability to maximize your output to meet demand, which they literally don't do right now because you are spending most of your resources and capital on just trying to acquire new patents. No, I won't be taking one right now. So that's probably what they're going to be doing. They're probably just going to be optimizing, making sure they can compete more efficiently. Why does this matter? One, because of the framing I already gave you at the top, but two, I think it is likely the case that making it more affordable also means that like health insurance companies are more likely to be like willing to cover specific things that in the status quo they're not willing to cover those payments of because they're way too expensive, right? Specific conditions where the costs upon them would be too high to the point where they wouldn't be willing to cover it in their cheapest plans. They'll be increasing access. We're not going to like fix the healthcare system, of course, but I think we're at least moving the needle significantly enough. I'll take the POI now. I just wanted to finish my point.
Yeah, so, oh, sorry, opening?
Yeah, I'll take the POI and then I'll answer the clarification. POI?
Okay. In a world in which pharmaceutical companies currently spend about like 75% of their profits on marketing, why is it so likely they will now just invest in drugs instead?
So the amount of money that they spend on marketing is probably not going to change on either side of the house, but the rest of the money is probably stuff that they are spending on things like R&D, which is the next like 25% of their budget. We're reallocating that as well. But secondarily, we think that they'll just like compete differently, which means that they'll use their marketing budget in terms of like, I don't know, saying they have better generics. Was there a clarification? Sorry, I didn't see. Oh, clarification more. Okay, great. Cool. So the second thing is, how do we change what kinds of drugs are going to be made? And this is the second thing here, right? So we think that our metric is one that makes it such that they actually care more about what kinds of things they're actually targeting, right? On your side of the house, they only care about securing a specific market share and using the patent to protect that market share. On our side of the house, given that that incentive does not exist, the only incentive that gives you a competitive edge is being the first to get that cash prize. And if that cash prize is directly tied to the quality adjusted life years that you're able to provide, then those are the kinds of things that you're going to be targeting towards, because that's what gives you the largest competitive advantage. You get more capital, which you can use to reinvest in specific projects or improve your marketing or whatever. So you still get a competitive edge, but it doesn't just completely lock out other corporations. So I think, for all these reasons, very proud to propose.
Great. I thank that speaker for the remarks and call upon the leader of the opposition to begin the case for the opt bench. You're here.
We do not have to support healthcare systems that are broken. Our claim is that their model is going to make things substantially worse. I'm going to start with our stance, briefly refute the PM, and then forward two arguments. Firstly, why innovation will substantially decrease, and then secondly, why we better promote affordability to drugs using our counter model. What is our counter model? Firstly, in cases of medical emergencies, we are fine with status quo where some drugs from the West are able to go to the developing world for free, i.e. what eventually happened during the AIDS crisis. This would, however, be reserved for fairly rare cases. Secondly, after patents have been created, governments are going to be subsidizing drugs for both the poor and for the lower middle class. Our subsidization scheme is going to exist on a sliding scale based on your income, where the poorer that you are, you can get these drugs totally for free. Note we have a massive amount of fiat power, because if Gov still wants any innovation, they're going to have to be paying like billions of dollars to these companies from the outset. We're simply just going to shift the burden of when this money is being paid. We support this via subsidization. Finally, we are fine with the status quo where patents tend to expire after 20 to 70 years, depending on the particular state. Brief rebuttal. I want to start by refuting their model of like governments are going to decide which drugs to fund based on quality adjusted life years. This is a horrible metric for two reasons. Firstly, the incentive of states are highly politicized, meaning that they do not view certain causes as being important. But secondly, there are a lot of illnesses where people feel pain every single day of their life, like chronic kinds of back pain, or like just a lot of pain that women experience during their periods. But these are not things that actually like detract from your life years. What this looks like is like medication for endometriosis. It doesn't really kill you, but like it affects the lives of a lot of women not being approved, like medication to make abortions less painful, etc., not being approved by governments. And the final thing I want to refute that will not be integrated was the claim that now innovation gets forwarded in better directions. To this, you would say, we think that the market is actually a good mechanism to determine the kind of innovation that happens. I would posit that things like research in cancer are already very popular for pharma companies because a lot of people are affected by these things. We just also support as an ancillary kind of innovation, rare diseases as well, right? Because a lot of people's lives are crippled from this. We support 20% of innovation in status quo still being directed to these really necessary diseases. First claim, why are they likely to substantially diminish the amount of innovation? To start by framing this argument, innovation is insanely expensive, and governments therefore need a guaranteed cash payout. Why is innovation so expensive? Firstly, there's a high level of uncertainty whether the particular thing that you're researching is going to succeed, right? It's not only that you don't know if the chemical compounds are going to work. There are often high thresholds for regulatory approvals, or for example, in phase 3 clinical trials, you need a very, very high success rate to actually get your drug out into the market, which is why these companies fail 90% of the time. No flashy news report of new vaccine for COVID ultimately fail. But secondly, the actual development process is highly expensive because it's often reliant on very pricey technology that ultimately exists. Therefore, companies will only have an incentive to innovate if they can get a massive amount of capital guaranteed. Why is the amount of money that companies will get under our side of the house substantially larger than their world? Firstly, governments are going to face immediate political constraints in terms of the amount of money that they're able to dish out to these companies at the outset. This is because each medication is only able to benefit a particular subset of Americans, and therefore there might be political pressure not to have massive subsidizations for drugs that are not benefiting everyone at the expense of other social services that people ultimately care about. The second thing to say, which is more important, is that there was just a time lag in terms of profit differences, right? The model for PM was so vague in terms of how much subsidization these companies are going to get. Even if you get $5 billion during year one, status quo is that companies for often 30 years are going to be generating triple that amount of money each year. So because you're allowed to profit into the future, the cumulative amount of capital that companies are getting under our side of the house is substantially larger. But finally, I think that prop literally concedes that these companies might somewhat lose their monopoly. I think that the industry will still be fairly oligopolistic for reasons I'll give in my second argument, but the fact that there's no guarantee that everyone will come to you for years in the future because there's now some competition will detract from your profit margins. The implicit rebuttal that we get to this from PM is but you have first mover advantage, right? You may win for 6 months, but eventually their own benefits are contingent on other companies being able to break into the market at some point, meaning that this is not guaranteed. The impact of this argument is that you're going to get substantially less drug development, right? I think this is true for all drugs, especially for mechanisms for innovation that have been less tested. So even for cancer treatment, you're going to get less of that because you're not going to try risky new innovation strategies. But most certainly, you're not going to get rare disease drugs being generated whatsoever if you don't know that the state will approve them, and when the payoffs of how likely you are to get that drug approved is very, very low. Why then should we prioritize a lot of drugs being created? Firstly, it is still a net win to allow upper and middle class people to get drugs, right? Even if you are wealthier, you're not evil. You do not deserve to die. Secondly, eventually people can access drugs once they're created. The first reason for this is that patents expire after a period of time in every single country, meaning that we get a long-term impact. But secondly, state programs of subsidization, even if imperfect, we will prove why they were good, can allow some means of access. But thirdly, there are just cumulative benefits for the medical community as a whole, where if you get an innovation strategy approved for one drugs, you then create more knowledge in the medical fields about how innovation works that can lead to a cumulative effect of more innovation perpetually happening. Second claim, why does our model promote greater accessibility to drugs? I want to start out by engaging in their roles and explain why it won't be perfect competition where all drugs are incredibly cheap. I think the first reason for this is that pharma companies will have an incentive to create an oligopoly type system. There are often only a few major pharma companies given the high fixed cost of being able to establish trust with consumers and medical innovation technology. Therefore, they can engage in a form of collusion where even if you create more competition, similarly to how oil companies operate under the status quo, they try and fix costs at a particular level. I think the second thing to say here is that when companies are now losing profit because you're not getting money from these drugs into the future, they might need to price hike out of economic necessity in order to sustain their bottom line. I think that thirdly, even if prices decrease 50% from status quo for a lot of people, poor people can still not afford EpiPen medication that is 50% cheaper, right? So they still lock out a lot of people. Why is our model of subsidization comparatively better? Just a few reasons why it will work. Firstly, the sum of money is going to be very, very large, right? They need billions millions just for like 1 year compensation to be marginally effective, we're just going to like redirect that. I think that secondly, governments will have some leverage over the kind of deal that they get with pharma companies when it comes to subsidization. This is because they can do things like threaten to impose like greater regulations on a particular company or not approve a particular kind of legislation that would help that company approve more drugs into the future, meaning that you can get a good package. Why then is our model of subsidization better? Firstly, it is a more strategic use of capital because they're like implicitly subsidizing wealthier consumers as well, whose like ability to buy drugs is not going to be swallowed into like the net subsidy that you're given, whereas we target people who are unable to afford drugs. But secondly, we just co-opt all the prop benefits because we actually allow like access to take place, right? We actually allow like poor Americans to be able to afford drugs for the first time, who their model still locks out of the market. For all of these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to stand in opposition.
Great. I thank that speaker for their remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Everyone ready? Yeah. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Hello?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Thanks.
Sorry, guys, can you just stop for a second? My partner just dropped out. Can we wait for like a minute? I think he's just coming back.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, we shouldn't use this time to prep though.
Sorry, I'm just waiting. I think he might be back. Karthik, are you back? I can see him on the participants list.
Yep, I'm back.
Right. Sorry, guys.
Okay, great. So without further ado, I call upon the DLO.
Thank you. I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to provide a new piece of constructive material about the political incentives of states, largely already hinted at by Naomi. And then I'm going to talk about 4 main points of clash. Before that, though, I want to just start off by talking about what our alternative looks like. Because the main piece of refutation from Tanay was largely just very, very flippant to what it is. So 3 things I want to note. The first is that this debate does not just happen inside of the United States, which is literally the worst healthcare system in the world. The majority of states have free healthcare, and given that's the case, that means that for many of them, the ability to access new drugs is larger of a priority than accessibility. Number 2, in this debate, we have the same amount of money and political will. Naomi identifies for you that it's literally billions of dollars that oftentimes goes towards pharmaceutical companies in their model for them to keep having an incentive to innovate. If that is the case, then we can equally use that money. Keep in mind there's also an opportunity cost. So that means that there is no possibility for them to predominantly give that money towards poor Americans or whoever on their side. The third thing I want to note, though, is even if we have the same amount of political will now, does not mean that we don't have the same amount of political will later, i.e., the POI that Naomi asked is so important, which is that for a politician with electoral incentives, is it more politically palatable for you to give money towards a pharmaceutical company, literally one of the most hated industries within the United States right now, or is it more politically palatable for you to give it towards something that currently has had a massive push already? For example, Warren and Biden and Bernie have largely been able to push forth a narrative of healthcare for all. Most Republicans do support it. They just didn't like the fact that Obama's name was put onto it. First argument then, onto the political incentives of states. There are two key reasons why this money is likely to be relatively low. The first is because it's a perception that you are giving an enormous amount of taxpayer money in the land of like individual liberty or whatever the hell towards things such as pharmaceutical companies. The second reason is because, as I've already noted, pharmaceutical companies are already incredibly hated right now. So there are three main consequences to this. Number one, they're unwilling to pay a large sum of money in the very beginning to incentivize this type of payout, because no politician wants to be the one to determine this sum of money. Neither is the individuals in the bureaucracy that they appoint for this medical care. Secondly, though, things such as rare diseases are unlikely to be the things that are funded. I want to add here that the ways in which you fund oftentimes have to do with the constituents that you think are the most important as well. So diseases that predominantly affect poorer individuals, for example, even things such as obesity, are more likely to be underfunded compared to diseases that predominantly affect richer Americans as well. The third thing, and this is so important, if their metric, which closing government unfortunately also have to defend, is literally the years of life that you have, then this screws over allocation to a massive degree. A lot of the reasons in which we care about medication is not just for the priority of life expectancy improvement. We care about it a lot because there are people that are suffering from certain forms of pain that are unlikely to be funded under their model. It looks like things such as antidepressants. It looks like things such as predominant pain medication for women. It looks like things such as pain medication for things such as chronic back pain. It looks like things such as the ability to have things such as like deal with anxiety disorders, which massively affect many Americans as well. So oftentimes keeping that in mind then, the way in which this metric happens means that allocation for the necessary drugs does not necessarily go there. So onto the points of clash. The first thing that we got out of government was this material about competition. There's three main things I want to note about this. Number one, this competition is still unlikely to exist. That's because right now, large pharmaceutical companies still have a stronghold over the market. They're likely to collude in the same way that oil companies currently do inside of the status quo. And because of the high startup costs, it's incredibly difficult for a small pharmaceutical company to break into that market. The second thing is, even if this competition exists, it only exists in the generic market, in the world, in the diseases that we already have drugs for, i.e. the ones in which in 20 years are likely to already have patents expire and things that we can subsidize as well. Importantly, the benefits that opening government has given so far are incredibly narrow and only focus on a subset of the diseases rather than the wide variety of diseases that we've discussed already. Finally, though, I think the amount of fiat power is not even symmetrical on both sides, because we give you structural reasons why you are able to fund more when the political narrative is going towards poor Americans compared to the political narrative of it coming to evil pharmaceutical companies. The second thing that they said is this vastly improves generic drugs. This is the thing though, the POI I asked is incredibly important because consumers on the market do not necessarily know the marginal difference in terms of how good each generic drug is. What they care about is oftentimes the brand name drug. So if it is that there are like 10 different types of aspirin, it's not going to necessarily change whether or not I buy the even the marginally cheaper aspirin if I don't know the brand necessarily, right? If that is the case, then it is a lie that most of the research funding goes toward distribution and development. Most of the funding that drug companies, no thank you, currently do largely goes towards things such as marketing. So it's just likely that they are incentivized to up the funding that they put into marketing more so that in the generic market they have a competitive edge. Closing go? No? Okay. So, final point of clash then. There are currently two profit incentives we told you about innovation that are incredibly important. Number one is the fact that it is incredibly risky in order to put your funding towards researching another drug. So you need a large payout, right? You need to have a guarantee of long-term payout. Secondly, though, when the market is over-patented, drug companies have an incentive to oftentimes look for their niche market area. So it's far more likely they put funding towards specific parts of drugs. So I want to recognize the framing of this, right? Because Naomi gives you a lot of weighing mechanisms. I'm going to add a few more. First of all, I want you to note how incredibly short-termist GovBench is, because they just kind of concede and capitulate that you're not going to get funding towards rare types of cancers or even cancers at all, because we're just so far away from them. So presumably in their world, there is a concession that there are certain diseases that there will never be medication for. I think on our side, the far more sustainable future is one in which you can guarantee funding on some sides. Secondly, though, many of these countries do have access to free healthcare, and many of the certain diseases need to be protected against right now. Innovation is massively important. It is the most important clash in this debate, and it was ridiculous for GovBench to concede it. Proud to stand on opening off.
Great. I thank that speaker for their remarks and call upon the member of government to begin the back half. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Just a couple seconds, let me get my timer out. Panel, okay, first let's deal with this like ridiculous counter model that OO is bringing up. You know, let's take them at their best. With all this fiat, they can like really reduce prices. I think the real question is not necessarily going to be where the revenue is subjected to, but what kind of disease actually gets development. We agree with OO, and that is probably the most important thing in that debate. Before we sort of really get into our case, some extraneous refutation on OO. Note off the top that when Chris makes the assumption that, hey, if you have free healthcare like the most of the world, this debate also just doesn't apply or have that much impact, right? Like, if we can just access drugs for free, then the situation necessarily isn't how much am I paying out of my pocket, but what drugs are actually going to be produced in order for me to access it freely. Note that later on when we prove that more rare drugs get developed on our side better. But first, on sort of like the patent expiration and the profit point, right? Note also that in a lot of developing countries, you have evergreening, right? Where Pfizer goes over there, creates a new drug, then every 20 years just like minorly changes the chemical formula and then gets another 20-year patent, right? The profits are literally going to be endless over on OO's like counter model wall, right? So either you need to fund a lot of money for perpetuity because these companies basically have these patents for rare drugs that no one ever wants to compete them on, or you actually do something reasonable, right? These companies aren't just going to stop producing drugs at all if they're going to see a lower profit margin, if the entire industry is also facing the exact same problems. So if you just like, I don't know, say like take like what you'd make in 10 years and just give that as a lump sum immediately, these companies can just focus on then researching more drugs instead of spending all that time marketing or branding or the 70% number that Chris wants to talk about, right? All that money can then be used for other research and getting more cash prizes from the government. So I don't see exactly how the profit incentives there are going to be changing. But next, also experiencing on political incentives, right? Like, I just don't get this argument. Obviously, it is super unpopular. Medicare for All has like 67% approval. Medicare Part D, where you negotiate directly with pharmaceutical companies, has like over 90% approval from the electorate. The thing those things never pass is because pharmaceutical companies line the pockets of elected representatives, not only in the US, but literally around the world. So no matter how much popular support there is for something, that just doesn't mean policies pass, right? At the end of the day, you need political support and pharmaceutical support in order to actually get things passed. The rest of my refutation to OO will be vote. But what is the core of the extension from closing government? We think that the speed of research development and the type of drugs that you develop on our side are going to be much more impactful. Why is this true? Because more pharmaceutical companies now just have the ability to do research, right? We agree with opening opposition that companies will only develop if they get a guaranteed cash payout. The central question is on which side there is more certainty. Note here that there exists a certain risk on our side that, you know, your payout might be lower than what you could be making in 20 or 30 years of market monopoly control, but the comparative risk of also gaining that revenue is much higher. And OG sort of misses the structural analysis, right? Because the risk of drug production is huge. It's not just, oh, it takes a lot of money and a lot of overhead and startup costs. It's because you have to put up enormous collateral in addition to seeing if other competitors are not producing the exact same drugs. Two things here. First, a single year of less than expected sales could literally devastate your capacity to repay loans, causing bankruptcy for a lot of smaller pharmaceutical companies that are first trying to get off the ground, right? These companies don't have hordes of cash to just expend on overhead. But secondly, another pharmaceutical giant could develop another drug that is chemically and effectively basically the same, but different in chemical composition. This immediately cuts into your market share, and any potential revenue that was planned with maybe a decade of projection, it just vanishes because another company produces, you both get exclusivity, right? And you're both not competing for the exact same market share of a drug that probably isn't that impactful. This is even more pernicious when you look at smaller pharmaceutical companies, such as like startups who are trying to introduce AI into research, right? Or different cutting edge resources to R&D, because they literally only have 1 or 2 chances to hit it big. And if you fail and another pharmaceutical giant just takes over whatever you're doing, you just lose immediately. You now get money up front, not for the chemical uniqueness of your drug, but for its effectiveness to combat a disease. Why is more research necessarily produced on our side and better? Oh, he just says, there's like iterative improvement and innovation. But I don't think that's necessarily true. The main 2 reasons you get is, one, the failure rate of drugs, when it is incredibly high, most research projects get stalled. And the choice then transfers over to, how can I gouge and how can I change existing chemical formulas, and not how much is this drug really needed, right? That's why you have 50 different drugs for like erectile dysfunction and like versions of Viagra, but you don't have one to treat progeria. Secondly, you have orphan drug research that massively increases. These are likely to be paid the most from the government because, you know, they have a most experiential impact on the people where they literally die because there's no drug that you can like cure your disease from. And because you get smaller, scrappier companies that can focus on whatever they think can solve these issues. There is no incentive that exists on the comparative, on like OO's counter model. So even to subsidize people to get these drugs, these orphan drugs just never get produced. There is no payout initially, and these companies just don't want to pay that amount. Thirdly, also look at antibiotics, right? A lot of drugs have incremental improvements that have massive changes in life, but you're never going to get production or research from those companies because they already have that market share. Currently, the price ceiling for a company's willingness to invest in a drug is capped at the total amount of revenue they can charge. O makes the mistake in assuming that there's just like no political incentive to develop these drugs, because though there's a huge block of people who either experience orphan diseases or just aren't being targeted, right? It's similar to blocks like the LGBT movement, where people of different orientations can bond together to create a larger block. If the costs for R&D are so high, one, certain drugs will be never developed because they affect the poor who just cannot pay, like asbestos or mesothelioma, and certain drugs will never be developed because they affect very small populations. Note here that this type of research must be weighed the most in this debate. Why is this true? 3 reasons. First, people cannot afford these drugs even if they have insurance or subsidization, right? Note that even if you get paid money, you can't just like invent this drug immediately, right? Like that drug doesn't exist for you to subsidize. Even if you have insurance, most insurance companies don't cover these drugs because they're so expensive. Secondly, you're often forced to turn to like fake drugs in places like China or whatever crazy homeopathic methods because modern medicine has just turned their back on you and is ignored on your side. On our side, you have a higher likelihood of success from recovering from this disease ever. Thirdly, we think that smaller companies that can now spend all their money on research are just going to collude because they have no such incentive. And even if they do collude, like oil companies, right, there's an equal incentive to just defect because if you're not spending money on marketing, you can just spend all that money on research. What are the impacts here? We focus on those who are basically guaranteed to die because there's no treatment or you can never hope to afford the payment. We provide a higher likelihood to survival on our side. Every other team in this round talks about drugs that are going to be produced anywhere. It's just which pharmaceutical giant is producing them. It's just marginal cost differences based on whether you buy OG or OO's mechanism. The drugs that we talk about don't exist on either side because we provide more resources to those smaller companies to exist research and to provide research for people that don't necessarily have an incentive to do so, proud to propose.
Great. I thank that speaker for their remarks and call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. As long as Western teams keep on doing this, we will keep on making developing country extensions and winning. Because what I think every other team in this debate has missed is that most people in the world who die of diseases do not die of small diseases in the Western industrialized rich countries that have mostly capacity to treat people anyway. Most people die from diseases in countries that don't have the capacity to do that, where they are too poor to afford drugs, and where they aren't served under Gov's world because the mechanism that actually makes it profitable to serve them isn't true anymore. Very simple extension. We get a better treatment for tropical diseases, diseases that affect the most people in the world, diseases like dysentery, typhoid, malaria, other diseases where even if we have some level of treatment right now, we never have better treatments once it can get better in our world. First, let's delete closing government from this debate. Firstly, they say, well, we get more types of companies, like these young, scrappy, small companies. Firstly, I want to question, they never give you a mechanism for how small, scrappy companies can come up in the first place, given that there are structural barriers to entering the market. For example, you need to have a large number of scientists working for you to do research. For example, the fact that you need to have the capacity to make like drug supply chain networks that often are really, really expensive to set up. There are really high fixed costs of setting up a pharmaceutical company. That means that small, scrappy pharmaceutical companies, whatever the hell those are, will never exist. But secondly, we often think that the way in which this works is that often if there are small companies, the incentive of pharmaceutical companies is to buy them up in the status quo. This means that they will never get small, scrappy companies to exist in their world. Insofar as having small companies compete more is the only mechanism the closing government has to get any change or any innovation, they literally have no impact in this round. The second thing to say is patents are bad because you might have like variation over year sales. Firstly, literally every business in the world has year-over-year variation in sales. This is not an argument about why this is bad to do so. But secondly, we think this is actually way more reliable than a prize because notice that with the prize money, it's not just about the money you got in the past. You have to forecast what prize money you'll get in the future. So you need to know not just what, like, it's much easier to forecast your sales on a drug that you had for like a year to say what you'll get next year. They're much more reliable to forecast rather than with a prize that you literally don't know how close you are to getting. So you don't even have the capacity to say, will we be in business next year, let alone any other means of planning. This means that it is significantly harder for them to get planning in their world. Then they say, look, there's more money. Firstly, this flies in the face of opening government's own model, where they say that this isn't necessarily going to be as much money as they would get from profits, as well as OO's analysis on why you can't possibly have as much money as they would get from this process. So the mechanism of like, we give them more money to do research literally cannot stand in the debate by every other team in this debate's admissions. But secondly, I think that even if they do get more money, the question is, what is that money being spent on? Like, we don't think it's necessarily profitable to spend it more on the actual things that benefit people. Like, recognize, if you get money for, if your only business model is getting prize money from the government, that makes you stop wanting to do all the really other important things that are important for a pharmaceutical company, like getting that into pharmaceutical markets for people to buy them. If the only source of profit you can get is not from selling them to people, but rather from getting prize money from the government, you're never going to have the incentive to give that money to people and therefore not have an incentive to provide access to the drug that will actually make people better off. Then they say like people will turn to homeopathy. Like, firstly, this is premised on there not actually being as much innovation, it's just an impact. But secondly, we don't think this is necessarily going to be the case insofar as generic drugs can exist and mitigate all the harms they talked about. Closing government is out. Extension then, and rebuttal to ODOs we integrated. Why do we think we get better treatment for tropical diseases? We think there are 3 reasons why a patent system uniquely encourages investment into tropical diseases. We think that what it really looks like in the status quo is looking at things like typhoid and saying that there are different ways that we can treat these, that we have some level of treatment in the status quo. We need better treatments because they can help people recover faster in the first place. Why do we think that we can get them in our world? Firstly, because there's an incredibly large market of people to sell to. You have massively, like, billions of people over the world who could potentially be our customers, and often hundreds of millions of people who do suffer from these diseases. Second, in the comparative, in their world, Western governments will never have the incentive to fund prizes that will actually support these diseases for 2 reasons. Firstly, the special interest groups who can have like some kind of influence over this lobby, over this office that sets up the prizes, will never have an incentive to lobby for diseases that don't affect the people in their country. But secondly, we think that often the way in which they have, like, even just like if they're super benevolent and don't have any kind of corruptive incentives, they often just don't have as much perspective and don't have as much knowledge or caring about the suffering of people in other countries. This is not the case that, like, and the third reason is because often if they do, people will see it as like handouts for foreign people that they will really be unhappy with and slash to begin with. This means that the funding and for prizes for tropical diseases in their world is literally insanely small. Even if they don't have some level of, like, even if they have some level of funding, it's always going to be significantly less than what you can get by selling to the incredibly large market of people who can afford it. The second reason for why we think that this is much worse for tropical diseases is because right now you can have the incentive to acquire pharmaceutical companies from developing countries to pick up their supply chain and actually distribute diseases, drugs to them. We think in the status quo, this is good, but in their world, you no longer have the incentive to do this because the process of acquiring a pharmaceutical company relies on you to have a steady cash flow. So you can't necessarily forecast in the future whether you will get this prize, and therefore you won't have the incentive to buy up that pharmaceutical company so you can start the distribution when you finish that to the fingers. This unpredictability means that there's no incentive to make riskier investments into things like tropical diseases. They're always going to be significantly riskier. You only have an incentive to do things like working on your evergreening that they talked about on their side, which makes it much worse in their world. The third reason why we get better treatment, and before I do that, I'll take a PR from opening government.
yeah, your analysis would be great if Merck hadn't already patented a typhoid-like cure in 2011 and dysentery cure in 2013 that already existed. We don't need the get rid of patents.
So the thing is, like, I don't think this is like opening government has this idea of like, well, everything's already done. Like, there's so much already done. I think this really confuses what a drug is, because often it's not just like, is there something that people can consume, but rather the different forms that it can take. Is it different delivery mechanisms? Is it different? Like, the opening government itself talks about the different delivery mechanisms that you can have, which is literally crazy that they say there's no other way to improve on it. But secondly, we think that often the way in which it works is that you have a more effective treatment coming up. So it is not just the same treatment, like which is like slightly tweaked. Obviously, we don't think that's going to happen in our world, but it can still be much better off for people. Okay, so this like, let's respond to what opening gov says about this. They say pharmaceutical companies don't innovate. Firstly, that this is, I already responded to like what the different types of meanings of drug are. But secondly, even if it's true in general, it isn't true specifically in the context of tropical diseases, because you have massive benefits in terms of the amount of people you can reach, often because like Western countries are becoming healthier and healthier, and the scope for you to sell to people in the Western world is going smaller and smaller. Pharmaceutical companies have to move towards the developing world in our world, whereas in their world, it's way too risky for them to do so. Why does this extension cleanly win the round? Firstly, opening opposition's case entirely relies on this like maybe they get the counter model, maybe they don't, but our case doesn't rely on it at all. It doesn't mean you can defend the status quo and still believe that our world is better. But secondly, insofar as the case is only about, to quote the DLO, places where healthcare is mostly free, it's absurd to think that they can represent the majority of people in the world. We think that we are the only team in this debate who is making sure that diseases are cured where they are most needed, who make sure that the people who get disease cures are the ones who actually suffer the most from it. Even if we think that there's some benefit to people in the developed world, we don't care, because the people who are most suffering from diseases, who die the most from chikungunya and dengue, are the people who we want to support in our world. We're incredibly proud to oppose.
Great. I thank that speaker for their remarks and call upon the government whip.
Hello, can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
I want to talk about two broad things in my speech. Firstly, on which side is research more likely to occur and more frequent, and secondly, on the accessibility of drugs. Firstly, let's talk about research, because we agree with opening opposition. Drug companies are only likely to develop if there's a safe guarantee of the money. The question at the end of the day that we were able to resolve was that even if we accepted them on their very highest ground and that compensation was low, this was still a comparatively safer guarantee than the status quo in research development for a number of reasons. First of all, because the status quo is one of gradual payouts over the 30 or 40-year period that you have a patent. You don't reap in that revenue at the very first day after you publish a good drug. You have to do it by slowly selling it over the course of 40, 50 years and having that slow cash flow come in to resolve your debts and actually make a profit. The problem is twofold. First one, if you only break even at the 15-year mark, this is extremely risky because you could go bankrupt any year before when you aren't having good sales and they're lower than expected sales. This is especially true because in order to actually invest in R&D, you often have to incur lots and lots of debt to do things like do research, to hire the machinery, to build the employees necessary to do so, which means that companies which are very debt-laden have very small room for error on their side of the house, and often this discourages them from investing in the very first place. Secondly, this is crucial, patents only apply to a chemical compound, not to the disease or treatment it's meant or designed for. This crucially means that often other pharmaceutical companies come in to develop a drug that can cure the same disease, but is chemically different and therefore doesn't apply to the same patent. If this happens, and it's a big company like Pfizer, they can immediately gouge the entire market for a smaller startup that developed a drug for the simple reason that that drug company doesn't have economies of scale. Once again, this discourages investment on their side of the house in the status quo. It is a not safe bet at all on their side of the house, and it's unsafe precisely because there's so much uncertainty over that 30-year window. What were the responses we heard? The first thing we heard was that, well, this doesn't really apply to small companies because there are high fixed costs incurred. There are two things to note. Firstly, this is not true, right? Like many small companies right now, including like tiny think tanks in Oxford and tiny think tanks in Massachusetts, are literally developing COVID-19 drugs right now. This is patently false because you don't need massive machinery to do this in many cases. Secondly, because this also applies to large companies, right? Large companies also don't do this for the very same reason that the gradual payouts over a 30-year span is often very uncertain compared to on our side. You get that money immediately, right? But secondly, they told us that it's easier to forecast the patented drug revenue as opposed to this massive prize money. But here's the thing. the uncertainty is the same, because on their side, you don't know if you're going to be the first one who actually gets the patent. If another company files for it before you, then you lose out even if you put in all that research. So the uncertainty is equal, but on our side, even if another company files first, you can still produce the drug, they just get the cash prize. But let's talk about them and why their side is unlikely, because we told you competition would actually be high. OO tells us the first reason is that pharma companies are reviled, so it's unlikely they'll get money. 3 responses to this. The first one is that there's often lots of lobbying by pharmaceutical companies to politicians, which means that they're generally very well supported because they are funded by the pharmaceutical companies. Secondly, because you're removing patents, and that's a very big deal. Like, people generally recognize the need for drug creation, and that's why in the US, antibiotics are subsidized to encourage innovation. This doesn't happen on their side of the house, right? Because if you have a politician tell the public that you won't get the drugs developed you need for cures unless we actually subsidize them, people are generally going to be amenable to that. We're not just throwing money at them, we're throwing out money at them, but removing the ability for them to monopolize an entire market, which is generally good. And here's why. Most people like caring about the free market, and they approve ideas like free competition. They're less likely to approve funding a market if they believe that market is monopolistic as compared to an outside of the house where they believe there's far more competition, but what you're doing is incentivizing people to compete and innovate, right? Secondly, they said orphan drugs don't get funded as a result of this. So here's a crucial thing to note. While the number of people affected by any single rare disease is very, very low, these groups tend to band and lobby together because that is what maximizes their political capital, right? So yes, if you have a tiny disease and only 10 people in the world have it, you're not going to get much traction. But that's exactly why these groups recognize that and band together with other rare groups and lobby together to say, you have to ensure all these diseases. You have to ensure that all these diseases have cash prizes. And that is precisely what happens for literally every other social movement that has a lot of intersectionality and lots of fracturing. They band together to create large collectives that have collective bargaining power. Then they said in CO that if you give lots of money to these companies, they will be bad. But we're not handing them the money. The money's conditional on you producing a drug that works. So presumably speaking, if they produce a drug that works, that's a lot of utility to society. We'd be happy to reward them for that. It is unclear to me why they think we're just giving money to them for free. Secondly then, let's talk about accessibility on their very best ground. Before I move on, I'll take a PR from opening up.
How does this not knife OG, whose case is literally we need to move away from orphan drugs and are not going to provide large subsidies to this, but your mech also does not work because as soon as these orphan drugs are released, a lot of people who have been waiting desperately for these drugs are finally going to get them, and therefore there actually will be a pool of capital.
Okay, so they get the drugs. That's a good thing. You're basically conceding that we cure lots of people and save lots of lives. Fine. Okay, then we win the debate on that. Like, we literally save more lives. Let's talk about accessibility then. OO runs a counter model about companies' rampant subsidies to the poor. 2 things to note. Firstly, their political analysis is symmetric, right? Like, people generally also don't support programs specifically targeted towards the poor. And that often means that, like, people only lobby for programs where you're able to give Medicare to everyone or give Medicaid to everyone. Again, that is not protected on their side of the house, and I just don't think that's something they can fight very easily. But secondly, and here's the best part, even if we accept their analysis, the drugs don't exist at all on their side of the house because they never gave an incentive for why these companies would develop the drugs. We told you very simply, there is a price ceiling in the status quo for considering the development of a drug. That is one that precludes development of drugs for people who are poor because they don't have lots of money. So if you have mesothelioma, if you have asbestosis, then you're fucked on their side of the house because no company will develop those drugs. On our side, paying people off based on the research and the cures they provide can encourage development in these areas, right? And we gave you the structural reasons why it would be extraordinarily likely that companies would invest and that people would lobby for relatively high results. Firstly, because people need these drugs to survive. So their lives are on the line. They're likely to politicize and agitate politically for the creation of prices for these, of prizes for these drugs, or else like they just wouldn't get cures, right? Secondly, because now companies have a larger incentive when they get that initial payoff, there's far more certainty involved with that, and they don't have to rely on a poor populace in order to help them. Let's deal with CO very quickly. They talk about investment in tropical diseases. Here's the thing. All of these diseases are generally already cured for because they have been eradicated from developed countries in earlier decades. These diseases are those that are generally globalized. They're not ones that only exist in Africa. There was malaria in Europe, and there was malaria, and there was typhoid in the US, and there was cholera in Europe beforehand. But these diseases were eradicated because those types of like vaccines were literally produced decades and decades ago. The problem of why they're not accessible right now is because no one has an incentive to go in, and those who have patents charge very highly on those patents to get the markets in developed countries as opposed to those in developing ones. But you know what? Even if we accept their best case scenario, that prize funding for these is very low, and these are very geographically unique diseases, and there are no cures for them in the status quo, there are no incentive for companies to develop them on their side of the house either, because even if the market's very big, these people are dirt poor. They have no insurance, there is no Medicaid in many countries in Africa, and therefore there would be no incentive because you could not make profit off of them. For those reasons, that's why no diseases have already been developed, and that's why we're happy to oppose.
Great. I thank that speaker for their remarks and call upon the op-wit to close out the debate. Here, here.